I picked up on the second ring. I always picked up on the second ring when that number called, because I had spent 18 years telling myself that if it ever did, I would not let it go to voicemail. Not again, not a second time. The screen lit up in the dark of my bedroom, and I saw the number, and my heart did not beat for what felt like a full minute. I answered. I said hello the way a man says it when he already knows something is wrong, or right, or impossibly both at the same time. And a voice said, Dad? My name is Harold. I am 63 years old. I live alone in a house in Knoxville, Tennessee, in a neighborhood where the oak trees are older than most of the families who live beneath them. I have a workshop in the garage where I build things out of wood when my hands need something to do, which is most days. My wife passed 8 years ago, a stroke, quick and without warning. My daughter lives in Portland with her husband and their 2 kids, and she calls me every Sunday morning without fail, which is the kind of thing you only appreciate after you have already lost too much. I had a son. His name was Danny. Daniel James Mercer. He was 24 years old when the accident happened, and he had his mother's dark eyes and my wide shoulders, and a laugh that came up from somewhere deep in his chest, the kind of laugh that made other people laugh without knowing why. He had been driving home from Nashville on a Tuesday night in November, on a stretch of I-40 where the rain had been coming down so hard that the highway patrol said later you could barely see the lane markers. A semi lost control on the overpass. The collision happened fast. By the time the paramedics reached the site, there was not much to identify. I was 50 years old when they put my son in the ground. I have never been the same person I was before that day, and I do not expect to be. There is a thing that happens to a parent after they lose a child that nobody talks about honestly. People come around for a while. They bring food and they say the right things and they sit with you in your living room and they mean every word of it. But grief is a long road, and most people can only walk so far down it with you before they have to go back to their own lives. And I understood that. I never held it against anyone. What I held on to instead was his voicemail. When Danny was alive, he had a cell phone with a number I knew by heart. After he died, I could not bring myself to let the carrier cancel it, so I kept paying the bill. $22.40 a month, every month, for 18 years. My daughter thought I was not coping well. My brother thought I had gone off the deep end. Maybe they were both right. But every year on Danny's birthday, the 14th of March, I would sit in my workshop after dark with a glass of bourbon I would barely touch, and I would dial his number, and I would listen to his voice on the outgoing message. Hey, you've reached Danny. Leave me something good. His voice, my boy's voice. $22.40 a month was nothing, less than nothing. The last time I had called that number before everything changed was March 14th of last year. I listened to the message twice, the way I always did. Then I hung up and sat in the dark for a while and went to bed. 6 months later, on a Thursday night in September, that number called me. Not me calling it. It calling me. I had been asleep for maybe an hour when my phone buzzed on the nightstand. I am a light sleeper. Have been since Danny died. My body never quite trusted sleep again after that night in November when the highway patrol knocked on my door and I was asleep and everything changed. So when the phone moved against the wood, I was awake before the second buzz. I looked at the screen. The number was Danny's. My first thought was that I had misread it. My second thought was that I was dreaming. My third thought was that it did not matter what the explanation was, because my hand was already moving and the phone was already at my ear and I had already said hello. And the voice on the other end said, Dad? It was not the voice from the voicemail. The voicemail was 24 years old, young and easy and unhurried. This voice was older. It was a man's voice, deep in the way Danny's had been getting just before the accident, but with something worn into it, something that had not been there before, like a piece of wood that has been out in the weather for a long time. Still the same grain, but different. I said, Who is this? There was a pause, a long one. I could hear breathing and what sounded like traffic in the background, maybe a highway, maybe just a busy street. The voice said, I'm not sure. I'm sorry. I don't know why I called this number. Another pause. I found a phone. I sat up in bed. My heart was doing something irregular that I did not have a word for. I said, "What number did you call?" He read it back to me. Danny's number. The number I had been paying for 18 years. I said, "That's my number. I pay for that number. That's my son's number. My son passed away a long time ago." The man on the other end was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'm sorry. I don't know how I got this phone. I woke up this morning and it was on the table next to me and I don't remember where it came from. I saw this number and something told me to call it." He stopped. "I'm sorry to bother you. I'll hang up." I said, "Wait." He waited. I said, "What's your name?" Another long pause. The longest one yet. He said, "David. People call me David." I asked him where he was. He said, "Nashville." I asked him what part. He seemed uncertain, said something about a shelter on the east side. Dickerson Pike, he thought. But he did not always have his bearings right. He said his memory was not what it should be, that doctors had told him this years ago, that there were gaps, large ones. I asked him how old he was. He said he did not know for certain. Doctors had estimated early 40s, maybe 42 or 43. He said he had been told he was found near a highway overpass a long time ago, that he had no ID, that he had spent years in state care before he was well enough to be on his own. I was sitting on the edge of my bed in the dark, with my feet on the cold floor, and I could not breathe correctly. An overpass. 18 years ago, on a highway outside Nashville. I said, "David, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be patient with me because I know this is going to sound strange. Is there anything you remember from before you were found? Any name, any face, anything at all?" He was quiet for a long time. When he spoke again, his voice was lower. He said, "Sometimes I dream about a workshop, wood shavings on the floor, a man teaching me to use a hand plane." He stopped. "I don't know if that's real or not. I don't know which of my memories are real." I put my hand over my mouth. A workshop, wood shavings, a hand plane. When Danny was 14 years old, I spent an entire summer teaching him woodworking. He was not a natural at first. He pushed too hard, and the plane would catch and skip, and I would stand behind him and put my hands over his and show him how to let the tool do the work. We built a workbench together that summer that is still in my garage. His initials are carved into the side of it, low down, where a 14-year-old boy would think to put them. D. J. M. I did not sleep that night. I sat in the kitchen with every light on and a cup of coffee going cold in my hands, and I tried to think clearly, which was almost impossible. I tried to be rational about what I knew and what I did not know. The facts as I understood them were these. 18 years ago, my son's car had been involved in a collision on I-40 near Nashville. The body recovered at the scene had been badly damaged. Identification had been made through a wallet and what the coroner described as sufficient physical evidence. I had not been asked to make a visual identification. I had trusted the process because I had no reason not to. People made mistakes. The thought entered my mind, the way cold air comes under a door. Slowly, but impossible to ignore once you feel it. I thought about the voice. I thought about the workshop. I thought about the fact that a man who did not know me had woken up that morning holding a phone with one number in it and had felt, for no reason he could explain, that he needed to call it. By 4 a.m, I had made up my mind. I called my daughter in Portland. She answered on the third ring, already alarmed, because I had never called her at 4 a.m. in my life. I told her everything. She was quiet in the way she got when she was trying to be careful with me, when she thought I might be heading somewhere painful. She said, "Dad, it could be a coincidence." I said, "I know." She said, "It could be someone who found a phone and called a random number." I said, "I know that too." She said, "Are you going to go?" I said, "I'm already packing." She did not argue. She knew me well enough. She made me promise to call her when I arrived, and then she said the thing she always said when she was trying not to cry, which was that she loved me and to be safe, and I told her I would, and I hung up and went to pack a bag. The drive from Knoxville to Nashville is 3 hours on a clear morning. I made it in 2.5. I had the address of the shelter on Dickerson Pike, which I had found online in the hour before I left. I pulled into the parking lot just before 8 in the morning, and I sat in my truck for a few minutes with the engine off, trying to settle myself down. I had been to this part of Nashville once before, years ago, before the accident, when I had helped Danny move into his first apartment, not far from here. We had carried boxes up a narrow staircase and eaten pizza on the floor of an empty room. And he had told me he felt like a real adult for the first time, and we had both laughed at that. The city looked different now. Most cities do, after enough time. The man at the front desk of the shelter was a heavy-set guy with kind eyes named Marcus. I explained the situation as plainly as I could, which I knew sounded strange. He listened without interrupting, which I appreciated. He said there was a man there who went by David, who had been a regular on and off for about 3 years, who generally kept to himself, who had some documented memory difficulties. He said the man was at breakfast. He led me to a dining room with long tables and fluorescent lights and maybe 40 people eating. He pointed to a man sitting alone at the far end of the last table. I stood in the doorway. The man was looking down at his tray. He was broad across the shoulders. His hair was dark, with gray coming in at the temples. He had a beard he wore short. He was wearing a green flannel shirt, the kind of shirt Danny had always favored, even when his mother tried to buy him something nicer. I must have made some sound, or maybe I moved, because he looked up. For a moment, neither of us moved. The room was full of the sound of other people eating and talking and chairs scraping on linoleum. All of it went far away. His eyes were dark, his mother's dark eyes. He set down his fork. He looked at me, the way a man looks at something he has seen in a dream that he cannot quite place in waking life. I walked over to his table. I pulled out the chair across from him and sat down because my legs were not going to hold me much longer. I said, "I called you back this morning, but the number went to voicemail." He said, "The phone ran out of battery. I don't have a charger." He studied my face. "You're the man from last night." I said, "Yes." He said, "You drove all the way here." I said, "I did." He looked at me for a long moment. There was something happening behind his eyes that I recognized because I had seen it in the mirror every day for 18 years. The look of a person who is reaching for something just out of reach. He said, "The workshop, the one I told you about." I nodded. He said, "There's a workbench in it, a big one, wood. I can see the grain of it when I try hard enough, and I can see a boy standing at it." He stopped. "I think the boy is me." I reached into my jacket pocket and took out my wallet. I had carried the same photograph since the summer Danny was 14. The two of us standing in the garage, him holding a hand plane and grinning at the camera, me standing behind him with my hand on his shoulder. My wife had taken it. The photo was soft at the edges now, and the color had faded some, but the faces were clear enough. I put it on the table between us. He looked at it for a long time, without touching it. Then his hand came across the table, slowly, and he picked it up. His jaw tightened. Not like anger, like something was being pulled tight from the inside. He said, "That's the workbench." I said, "Yes." He said, "That man, that's you." I said, "That's me." 26 years ago. He set the photo down. His hands were not quite steady. He said, "And the boy." I could barely get the words out. But I had driven 3 hours and waited 18 years, and I was not going to stop now. I said, "The boy is my son. His name is Danny. He was 14 years old when I took that picture. He grew up to look a lot like that boy does in that picture. Same shoulders, same eyes." I stopped. Same laugh, like it came from somewhere down in his chest. The man across from me put both his hands flat on the table. He was staring at the photograph. His breathing had changed. He said, "I don't remember my name." I said, "I know." He said, "I don't remember most things, just pieces. A smell, a sound, a workshop." He looked up at me. "I've been trying to remember my whole life, and most of it won't come." I said, "I know. I think I understand why." He said, "How do you know?" I told him. I told him about the accident, about the night the highway patrol came to my door, about the identification, about the things that had never added up, that I had pushed down because pushing down was easier than the alternative. A car fire. A body that required no visual confirmation from a father who was right there and available. the nagging wrongness of it that I had buried under grief because grief was at least something I understood. He listened to all of it without moving. When I finished, the dining room had mostly emptied out. Marcus was standing near the door with his arms folded, giving us the room. The man across from me looked down at the photograph again. He said, very quietly, "Danny?" It was not a question. I said yes. He said it again, like he was trying it on, like a man putting on a coat he has not worn in years to see if it still fits. Danny. I did not trust my voice at that point, so I did not use it. He looked up at me. His eyes were bright. He said, "Say something. Something I would know if I was him." I thought for a moment. Then I said, "You always burnt the toast. Every single time. Every morning. Your mother used to say you could burn water." I stopped. She used to say it laughing. She loved you so much she thought even your burnt toast was something to smile about. Something moved across his face. He said, "Toast." I said, "And you had a dog when you were young. A brown mutt we found at the pound. You named him General. You were 8, and you were going through a phase where everything had to have an important name." His eyes closed. I waited. He said, "General slept at the foot of my bed." I said, "Every night for 12 years. He opened his eyes. Neither of us said anything for a while. Then he said, "How do we know for certain? I don't want to give you something and then take it back. I don't want to do that to you." I said, "We do a test, a proper one. Today, if you'll let me, I'll drive us to a clinic right now. We get the test done and we wait for the results, and whatever they say, I'll accept." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "And if it comes back wrong?" I said, "Then I'll drive home knowing I did everything I could, and I'll still be glad I came." He looked at me for a long time. He said, "And if it comes back, right?" I said, "Then I take you home, and we build something in the workshop, and I will teach you to use a hand plane again if you need me to, or you'll pick it right back up like you never stopped. And either way, it'll be the best afternoon I've had in 18 years. He picked up the photograph one more time. He held it in both hands and looked at it hard. Then he nodded. We drove to a testing clinic on the west side that I had found on my phone while we were still sitting at the shelter table. The woman at the front desk was efficient and kind. She explained the process. She took our samples. She said standard turnaround was 3 to 5 business days, but that she could submit us for an expedited result given the circumstances. She had heard all manner of things in that job, she said, but she would do what she could. While we waited for the paperwork, my son, the man I believed was my son, and I sat in the plastic chairs of the waiting room, and I told him about his mother. I told him she had been a teacher, 3rd grade for 22 years. I told him she had a way with kids that was almost like a superpower, where even the most difficult child would eventually come around to her. I told him that she used to hum when she cooked, and that she could not carry a tune to save her life, but that she hummed anyway, constantly, like background music to our whole lives. I told him that she had never stopped grieving him, that it had been a part of her until the day she died. He listened to all of it. Sometimes he would nod slowly, like a man confirming something half-remembered. Once, when I described the kitchen in the house where we raised him, the green tile behind the stove that we always meant to replace, but never did, he said, very quietly, "Green tile." Not surprised, just confirming it. I told him about his sister. He did not remember her by name, but when I described her, the way she used to follow him around the yard when she was little, trying to do everything he did, falling down and getting up and refusing to cry because she was determined to keep up with her big brother, something in his face softened in a way that was so familiar to me that I had to look at the floor for a moment. On the way back to the shelter, I stopped at a diner on Gallatin Road. We sat in a booth, and I ordered us both coffee and the breakfast plate because neither of us had eaten properly. He put 3 sugars in his coffee without thinking about it. I watched him do it. Danny had always taken 3 sugars. His mother used to say it barely counted as coffee at that point. He caught me watching and said, "What?" I said, "Nothing. Just glad to be sitting here." He looked at me across the table with those dark eyes that were his mother's eyes, and I think he understood what I meant, because he nodded and wrapped both hands around his mug and did not say anything else. And we sat there in that diner booth with the morning light coming through the window and the smell of coffee and bacon in the air. And for the first time in 18 years, I did not feel the particular weight that had been living between my shoulder blades since the night the highway patrol came to my door. I drove back to Knoxville the next afternoon. He was not ready to leave yet. He needed time, he said, which I understood. He had built a small life in Nashville, loose and uncertain as it was. He had a caseworker he trusted, and a routine, and a group of people at the shelter he had come to rely on. Pulling all of that up overnight, even for something this enormous, was not something I would ask of him. He had already lost enough without me rushing him toward anything. I left him my number, not Danny's number, mine, and I told him that whenever he was ready, I would come back, or I would send his sister, or I would just stay on the phone with him for as long as he needed to talk. He said, "She'll want to come. Your daughter." I said, "She's been asking to come since 4 a.m, on the day I called her." Something crossed his face that I had not seen on him yet. The beginning of a smile. It was crooked on the left side. Same as always. He said, "Tell her to give me a couple weeks." I said I would. The DNA results came back in 4 days. I was in the workshop when I got the email. I sat down on the workbench, Danny's initials pressing into the back of my thigh through my jeans, and I opened the attachment with shaking hands, and I read the confirmation twice through before I put the phone face down on the wood and sat there in the quiet of the garage and let myself feel it. The probability was listed as 99.998%. I put my hands on my knees and I looked up at the ceiling of my garage, and I thought about my wife. I thought about how she had kept his room exactly as it was for 3 years after the accident. How she had refused to pack his clothes. How she had told me once, late at night when neither of us could sleep, that she did not believe he was gone, that some part of her refused to believe it, and I had told her gently that sometimes we held on to things to survive, and that was all right. I had been wrong. She had been right all along in the way that only a mother can be right about something like that. I wished she could have known. I called my daughter. I did not have to say much. She already knew from the sound of my voice in the first 2 words. She was quiet on the line for a moment, and then she made a sound I had not heard her make since she was a little girl, and we stayed on the phone together without talking much, and that was enough. He came home 6 weeks later. I drove back to Nashville and loaded the few things he had into the back of my truck, not much more than a duffel bag and a box of books he had picked up here and there over the years. On the highway back toward Knoxville, he sat in the passenger seat and watched the Tennessee hills go past and did not talk much for the first hour. I did not push. I had spent 18 years learning patience the hard way. Eventually, he said, "Tell me something about myself." Something I did, not something that happened to me. I thought about it. Then I said, "When you were 16, you decided you were going to build a birdhouse, a real one, not a kit. You drafted the plans yourself on graph paper. It took you 2 weeks, and the measurements were off, and the roof leaked when it rained, and you fixed the roof, and the measurements were still off, but you put it up in the backyard anyway, and a family of wrens moved in the following spring." He turned to look out the window. After a moment, he said, "Did the wrens come back the year after?" I said, "Every year, for 6 years." He nodded. He kept looking out the window. After a while, he said, "I want to see the workshop." I said, "That's the first place we'll go." We got home just after 4 in the afternoon. I pulled into the driveway, and we sat in the truck for a moment. He was looking at the house. I watched him take it in. The oak in the front yard that had been there since before I was born. The porch where my wife had sat every summer evening. The garage door, slightly uneven in its track the way it had always been. He got out of the truck. He walked to the garage, and I hit the button on my key fob and the door went up. He stepped inside. He stood in the middle of the workshop for a long time. He looked at the tools hung on the pegboard. He looked at the sawdust on the floor. He looked at the workbench. He walked up to it and ran his hand along the surface. He crouched down. He looked at the side of the workbench. DJM, carved in the wood, low down where a 14-year-old boy would think to put it. He put his hand over the letters. I stood in the doorway of my garage and watched my son kneel on the concrete floor with his hand on the initials he had carved when he was 14 years old, and I did not say anything because there was nothing to say. And because I had used up most of my words over the past 6 weeks, and none of them were adequate anyway. He stayed like that for a while. Then he stood up. He picked up the hand plane from the shelf where I kept it, the old Stanley I had used my whole life. He turned it over in his hands. He set it against a scrap of pine I had on the bench. He pushed it forward once, slowly, adjusting the angle, and a clean, thin ribbon of wood curled up from the blade the way it always did when you got the pressure right. He looked over at me. I said, "Not bad." He said, "Show me again." I walked over and stood next to him. I put my hands over his the way I had done when he was 14, and together we pushed the plane down the length of the board, and the wood came away clean and easy, and the smell of fresh pine filled the garage, and I thought about all the years between this moment and the last time we had stood here together like this. 18 years of silence and grief, and $22.40 a month just to hold on to a voice, all of it folding up and becoming something smaller now, something that would always be a part of us, but would no longer be the whole story. He said, "I want to go see her, the grave. I know it's not really. I know I'm standing here, but I want to go." I said, "We'll go tomorrow." We went in the morning, before the day had warmed up. The cemetery was on the west side of town, in a quiet section with big trees. I knew the way without thinking about it. My wife was buried 2 rows over from the stone we had put up for Danny, and I visited them both whenever I came, which was more often than I probably should have admitted to anyone. He walked ahead of me on the path. He knew which one it was before I pointed, I think, because he stopped in front of it and stood there with his hands in the pockets of his jacket. Daniel James Mercer. The dates, beloved son and brother. He looked at the stone for a long time. Then he said, "I can't decide if this is strange or not." I said, "I think it's both." He said, "Do you believe things happen for a reason?" I thought about that seriously. I said, "I didn't for a long time. For about 18 years, in fact." I stopped. "I'm reconsidering." He turned to look at me. He said, "I called that number because something made me. I don't have another explanation. I woke up with a phone I don't remember, and I looked at a number and I called it. I don't know what that means." I said, "I don't either. I'm not sure we need to." He looked back at the stone. He said, "Tell me something about her." He nodded toward his mother's section. 2 rows over, I said. She hummed when she cooked. She couldn't carry a tune. She did it anyway, every single day, every meal she ever made. And after she was gone, I missed it more than I expected to. The house was quiet, in a way it had never been before. He was quiet for a moment. He said, "I can almost hear it." I said, "I know. Me too." We stood there together in the morning light, the 2 of us, with the trees overhead and the grass still damp and the whole long quiet of that place around us. I thought about $22.40 a month. I thought about all the March 14ths I had sat in the garage alone and dialed a number just to hear a voice. I thought about what it means to refuse to let go of something even when everyone around you says you should. My daughter thought I was not coping. My brother thought I had gone off the deep end. Sometimes the thing they call not coping is the only thing keeping you honest. He put his hand on my shoulder. His grip was strong. He was a broad man, my son, broad across the shoulders the way I had been when I was younger. He stood next to me at the gravestone that had his name on it, and he kept his hand on my shoulder, and neither of us needed to say anything because we had the rest of our lives to say things, and that was the largest thought I had ever had. The rest of our lives, the sheer scope of it. And I let it fill me up. When we walked back to the truck, he said, "I still don't remember everything." I said, "That's all right." He said, "It might come back slowly. The doctors always said it could. Piece by piece." I said, "We've got time." He said, "The workshop helps, being in there. I think the hands remember things the brain forgot." I said, "Then we'll spend a lot of time in the workshop." He said, "I want to build something." I said, "Tell me what." He thought about it. Then he said, "A birdhouse, a real one, not a kit." I stopped walking. He was 2 steps ahead of me when he realized I had stopped. He turned around. I said, "You remembered." He looked at me steadily. Something in his expression told me that maybe he had remembered for a little while now and had been waiting for the right moment. Or maybe the memory had just surfaced on its own the way memories do, without warning, like something rising from deep water. He said, "Wrens, right? They always came back." I said, "Every year." He looked at me for a moment the way you look at a place you have been trying to find for a long time. Then he said, "Let's go home." And we did.